Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got myself, Brad, you've got Spencer, and also Darrius here today to talk about some things that you can do leading up to a penetration test. Right. So we're going to talk about, some things to kind of tidy up. So we're going to talk about things to make it more valuable to you. But ultimately, what we want to do is make that process as seamless as possible. And so that's kind of what we're here to talk about. Just some quick admin notes. If you find this useful, please rate, share, like, all that good stuff. It really helps us out a lot. And anything that we talk about, there'll be a link to in the description. So if you follow us by now, you know that Mr. Spencer is our internal penetration tester specialist dude. And, he's got some tips for you to start out with on those, right?
Yeah, definitely. So before we get into it, I'd just like to note that we have matching shirts today. So if you're not watching this on YouTube, go check it out on YouTube. And while you're there, subscribe and share it and all that stuff. So
awesome.
It's Darrius and I's second day in a row wearing the same shirt. We recorded yesterday and we were wearing the same shirt. And now today we're wearing the same shirt. So I think it's a thing. It's a thing.
It
now,
is.
Darrius.
We're just going to post up tomorrow's shirt in the group chat from here on out.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, go for the trifecta, man, next time.
Yeah, we'll do it.
Cool. So this is something question we get asked a lot. A client is looking for their first pen test, or maybe it's their second, or maybe they haven't had one in a while. And they're like, what should I do to prepare for you guys to come in and do a pen test? Whether it's an internal, external, web, whatever. For an internal, which is my kind of specialty right now, a couple things that I would encourage clients do or people do before they have a pen test is one, make sure you have a good password policy. Kind of foundational and basic, but make sure you have strong passwords on admin accounts and service accounts. Make sure those passwords are long and strong. Make sure they're not using the company name or things that are easily guessable, and make sure that they're unique, right? Make sure you are not using the same password for multiple accounts. So that's step number one, is making sure you have a good password policy, good count lockout policy, making sure that the policy fits your organization. Nobody likes to have to put 30 characters in to a password for a printer or something like that. So obviously it has to be commensurate with the risk that account poses. But that's really the first thing, is passwords. The second part of that is, and maybe arguably more important, is file shares. I think this is probably my favorite topic. Brad and Darrius hear me talk about this ad nauseum. Pretty much every pen test we do, we find file shares, and inside those file shares, we see plain text credentials. So that can be...
Folks, he's not exaggerating when he says every pen test that we do.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's the only finding that exists on every single internal pen test of 2022.
Yeah. Yeah. And, some of the... I'll share some of the unique ways we found plain text credentials in file shares. But, the basic ones are PowerShell scripts that are used for automation or daily IT administrative tasks, right? IT administrators don't realize that the share is readable by everyone, and they are just trying to get their work done, and they have scripts to automate their tasks, and they inadvertently reveal credentials in those things. We've seen, go ahead, Darrius.
I was saying, which kind of just brings me back to, if you listen to previous podcasts of, I think IT admins and those on the infrastructure team, whatever it is that you're in your company, we have to start treating our scripts the same way development teams treat their code. It is code, so it needs to have a standard. Make sure it has change control, and then at the bare minimum, don't hard code credentials.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, having a password vault, Darrius, having a key management system for those credentials. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I meant to just think that, not say that.
That's like a running joke for the years. Every time I mention it.
Well, it's a bummer too, because they make a solid product. They just need to listen to the podcast is what they need to do.
We should send it to them. So password vaulting, key management system, something to securely store those credentials instead of putting them in scripts. So that's the second one. First one was passwords. Make sure those are good. Second one is file shares. Make sure those are good. audit those on a regular basis, look for the word password. You can go out to the file explorer and just search manually. You can use some tools, you can use PowerShell scripts to do it, whatever you want to do, but do that on a regular basis to start crawling your file shares and looking for sensitive info. Because I'll tell you, it's not just passwords that are out there. A lot of times, I see users that put their credit card numbers in files or their social security numbers, or they'll download, their tax documents or whatever it might be. And that's still a risk to the organization. So definitely look for those things prior to Pentest. Have a recurring process for that. The third one is, I don't know, probably a tie between like making sure local user accounts are restricted appropriately and making sure that you have good tamper protection or at least a good EDR product, right?
That's the one that would have been mine too. Would be the EDR thing. Is we see a ton of it where these people they go out and they spend EDR is not cheap, right? Relatively speaking, and to spend all this money on it and then take the defaults on the install, right? Yep. And not ever, can you just disable it, right? Like can if the user's an admin, can they just uninstall it? So yeah, it's not a silver bullet, and it requires some grooming to be effective.
Yeah, definitely. And to make AV EDR kind of that number 3 on the list, obviously tamper protection, and then just testing the product itself. Mm-hmm. Does it raise an alert when I try to save the SAM database or the SAM Hive from the registry? Does it alert? Can I elevate if I get administrator access and I use something like PSExec to elevate to system? Is that something that the product alerts on? Will it block it? Will it quarantine? And then part of that, so testing the product, making sure it works as expected, making sure tamper protection is enabled. And then the third part of that little category would be making sure that it's doing what you expect it to do, but also that the host quarantining process is working. I was on an engagement once where I did something very rudimentary. I did reg save on the SAM Hive, and the host was quarantined. It kicked me off, disconnected the NIC, and I'm off, right? I just waited. I took like 2 minutes. I waited. I was doing something else. I turn and I look, and the machine had restored its network connectivity, and I was back on the box that I had connected to. And that file, that SAM file that I had created, was just sitting there on the desktop waiting for me. So it worked. It just resumed the network adapter too soon. It probably should have just failed closed and not let me back on that until somebody had taken a look at it. Right. So making sure that you have EDR and making sure it's working as expected would round out that number 3 for me for internal. And those are like the big 3 for me for internals.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, man, I can't stress that EDR piece enough, because we talk to a lot of clients, and one of the questions we'll ask sometimes is how confident are you going into this, especially when we're talking about internal pen testing, because we view internal penetration testing as a more advanced offensive testing mechanism, and meaning that we would expect the level of maturity of the organization to be higher than average if they're seeking an internal penetration test, because of the things you just described. If those 3 things aren't squared away, Spencer's sitting here looking at a domain admin prompt, 2 hours on Monday, 2 hours into Monday morning, right? He hasn't even finished his first cup of coffee, and he's like, "Oh, I got domain admin 3 different ways," and so yeah, you still get some value out of it, right? But what we're really there to do is test controls, and we can't test controls that aren't there. And so it really kind of takes away from what you should get out of an internal penetration test if you don't meet those 3, kind of maturity checkpoints that Spencer just talked about. So agreed. All right, Mr. Darrius, what do we need to do to prepare ourselves for you beating up our web application?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of take a different approach to this topic. So first of all, web app penetration testing, I feel like it sits in a really unique space. It's one of the few forms of penetration testing where the client gives you the credentials up front. So, ultimately the goal is to test the code of the web app. And so with that, just a couple of things that I have are first, make sure you have a test environment configured prior to, um, unless you really want us testing in production, but that is very risky. Personally, I sleep better at night knowing that I'm in a test environment. And
Man.
kind of, one, the test environment, I think, benefits you even outside of the engagement, right? You should be able to spin up a test environment for a multitude of use cases, even if it's just as a part of your production cycle, right? You should A test environment should be spun up so that you can go through tests before you go to production. So having that, I think, is crucial. And kind of the one thing I like to point out specifically with that is making sure that you separate your testing environment from your production environment. So I don't know about you, Brad, but one thing that I see a lot is like, oh yeah, we have a test environment. Just go to dev dot, whatever the web app is. But then as I'm
Shared host.
as I'm exploiting it, it's a shared host, or that you're using production data and it's pointing to the same database as production, which at that point we're pretty much testing in production.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So
So let's talk a little bit about, what you expect specifics from a test environment like that. So you mentioned having it separated. What about the data behind it?
Yeah, so I think the data behind it, you want it as close to production as possible. So like you want the schemas and all of that to be the same, right?
Yeah.
But as far as the data, specific data, I, truthfully could care less whether it's real data, whether it's fake.
But it has to have something, right? Because that's one of the things we've run into in the past is, we get a test environment and they'll spin up a dedicated environment just for us, which is cool if you have that capability. But then we get an empty, all the tables are empty.
Yeah.
Right. And so what are we testing?
It has to be properly configured. That's the other thing. So like, if you have a test environment, you're getting a pen test, even if all of like, it's a one-to-one match, does not matter if it's not configured how a normal end user would interact with that app.
Yep. So that's actually really smart. I never thought about using that terminology. Is your test environment should be usable to a client, to the intended end user. So think about it in that perspective. I wish I would have thought about that 20 years ago, dude, because it simplifies the entire process. Like, hey, think about it. If you were going to use that test environment as if it were in production, what all do you need to be there?
Yeah. And that's
you solve it right there.
It gets forgotten a lot. And I get it.
It does.
Especially, if you're just trying to get something out the door, or like creating a testing environment isn't an easy feat. It takes a lot of work up front, but once you get it right, you're golden.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing I was going to say is, one, have your accounts and roles already mapped out and already created. We only have a limited time for each engagement. So having that before the engagement even starts is crucial. And whatever pen testing firm you're working with, they should communicate that with you during the kickoff call, saying, hey, this is what you need prior to get the ball rolling. There's nothing that, sucks more than getting on an engagement and, okay, it starts on Monday and I don't have any creds.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know why it's so common in web apps, dude, but like it happens 40% of the time, maybe more, where, we're like, hey, we need creds, we need the link to the test environment, whatever it is. And APIs are really bad about it too, where, we don't get the YAML or we don't get what we need to start the test. It's just a strange phenomenon that only seems to occur in web app pen testing. I don't know why.
And I would say, unless you outline it during the kickoff call, like I will say for every role. So whether you have admin, end user, etc., unless you only want them to focus on a specific role, you want to create accounts for every type of role, because something that often gets overlooked is broken access controls. I was on a pen test last year where it's like, a normal user has access to admin functionality as long as they just navigate directly to it.
Yeah.
Can't
You
find
said
that.
you said last year like it wasn't 18 days ago, but
All the way last year.
way back when, you know.
It was early last year, so I'll count it.
Back in the day when you had to walk uphill both ways.
Right, to get to your web app pen test.
But yeah, would have never found it unless I had the different types of roles to be able to manually navigate and see if I can get to that page.
Yeah.
Something else that I'd say that you touched on is inventory your application or your API. That, in my opinion, is step one. Above all else, like if you don't have that, one, I think you should be terrified. So a prime example would be if I have an API and I can't tell you, hey, these are my endpoints, that right there should terrify you if you're on a security team at a firm, wherever you're at. Because if you don't know what's out there, then you don't know what can be exploited. I will do my best to, discover as many endpoints as I possibly can, but I'm not perfect. And so having not only having a list of endpoints, but what they're expecting, the syntax, really, whether it's a Swagger file, a YAML file, Postman collection, number one, if you can do that. But having that and having all your endpoints in your web app inventoried and documented firsthand is really going to make sure you're getting the bang for your buck when you're getting a pen test. Because otherwise, if I have to spend the first half of my day, trying to figure out what all the endpoints are, that's half a day that I could have been working on, exploiting and, poking around your app. So that's another thing. Let's see. Next, I'll say, consider lowering some of your controls. And I say that, I've said it before, but I'm here to test the code and the logic of your application, not your WAF.
Right.
If you want me to test your WAF, that's fine. We can do that. But at the end of the day, if it's something is vulnerable to SQL injection and you're relying solely on your WAF, at some point WAFs can be bypassed. Give me enough time, I'll do it. But is that really how you want me to spend my week? Versus I can tell you right now, like, hey, this is vulnerable to SQL injection, and you can fix it within the code itself. So that way, you're not relying 100% on your WAF. Controls are supposed to work in tandem, but the best way to resolve problems is for them to not exist in the first place. And the last thing,
let's talk about the WAF for just a second, because I think that's an important consideration that a lot of people don't, maybe don't dive into. So, my background in financial security, right? So we obviously had a lot of web apps. They had to be secure. We had WAFs in front of them, but our testing protocol whitelisted us in the WAF, right, for all the pen testing that we did. And typically, right, we would not want for you to change your security configuration for us. Like in internal pen testing, dude, turn that shit all the way up, right? I want it to be all the way up. So it's representative of your real environment. Same thing with external penetration testing, right? I don't want you to whitelist me, dude. I want to come at you like a random, hacker. But in a web app environment, web applications are weird, man. And to your point, a WAF, at least in my personal opinion, a WAF is like you said, it is a layered control. And it is meant to work in tandem with other controls. It is not intended to solve your web application problems. Okay. So, we don't even care about your WAF, right? We're not paying Darrius to evaluate the security of our WAF, right? If we're going to do that, just call Cloudflare and we'll go pen test their stuff. Right. But we want to look at your application. And one of the things one of my old bosses used to say all the time is that firewalls are one misconfiguration away from exposing everything to the internet. Yeah. And so I love that saying because it forces you not to put all of your faith in this one piece of equipment or this one, cloud instance. And especially in cloud WAFs, because, who knows? Those things, they may fail open. It certainly can't fail close because now my site's offline. You can just DOS it for free. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to go off on too big of a tangent about WAFs, but I'm absolutely against using them as a sole control.
Agreed. And I guess to the last point, I will say is, if possible, demo the app to the penetration tester prior to, or even consider giving them access to the source code. And I'll say that because one, once again, it really just comes down to a time thing.
Yeah.
We have the engagement may last, a week. Do you really need me to spend the first, a good chunk of the first day of me just trying to figure out, oh, this is the workflow for the application? I can do that, or I could spend, you can get more bang for your buck if I spend my time actually attempting to exploit and, find vulnerabilities. So that's kind of something you might want to consider there, either demo or at least the source code. You'll be surprised what you can find just by doing a cursory, glance at the source code, reading through things, and to be able to be like, oh, you're not sanitizing your input there. Or like, oh, you're sanitizing there, but you're missing these characters. And those are things that can be pretty much written up preemptively.
Yeah.
And, the rest of the engagement, you can focus on some more complex things.
I think it also allows us to be more prescriptive with resolutions, right? Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at the report and, like, for example, if I have an input sanitization that's missing on a form field somewhere, right? That might be all that finding is, because like you said, it's a time limited engagement. And, maybe I didn't have enough time to write a fully functional exploit. So this becomes a medium or a low when it's probably should have been a high. Once I realize there's not, sanitization occurring on that form field, I go check the source code and be like, oh, wow, this is a huge thing. And if I just, change my payload this much, it goes through. It'll, like you said, allows us to be more efficient, but also I can say, hey, that file right there, line 726, if you change this one function, then all of them go away, right? So it allows us to be more efficient and more prescriptive in solving the security issues.
Sure. Which is ultimately at the end of the day what it's all about.
Well, and that's something else that you kind of like got my brain going on, right? Is look at the objective of the pen test. Is the objective of the pen test, and if you read the first paragraph of our pen test reports for external and internal pen testing, is going to say something like the objective of this pen test is to see what an advanced persistent threat can do, blah, 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 right? So it's already explaining to you what the goal is. A web application is a different scenario entirely. We're trying to look at that thing front to back completely as we possibly can within our time limit and help you find and fix as many security vulnerabilities as possible. It just has a different objective. Right. And so I feel like we have to treat it as a different animal because it is,
Sure.
Okay. So the last one is external pen testing, which I think is the easiest to talk about because it has the least things that you need to do. Right. And I only have two things on my list. Right. Number one, and this is going to come to a surprise or come as a surprise to literally no one, is know what you have. Okay. The external penetration test should not be an exercise of how good is Brad at finding my stuff. It should be an exercise of, what risk does my stuff pose? And therefore, the more information you give us in your scoping documentation, the more thorough we can be. And I cannot tell you how many, 50%, maybe more, of external penetration tests we find things people didn't know they had. Right.
That's terrifying.
It is, right? I would be,
Yep.
And so it goes back to blocking and tackling, right? How's your asset management? How are you keeping track of your public facing footprint? You need to know what you have. And often cases, we're not doing like super crazy ninja stuff, right? We're just like enumerating DNS or enumerating historical DNS. And suddenly we find an old IP address and a host name, that somebody got rid of, but they didn't decommission the server. It's sitting out there with 33 to 9 open. So like, just know what you have and keep track of that stuff, right? This is like IT, level 101. And communicate that with us. Again, we, especially on external penetration tests, they tend to be shorter engagements. And so, we only have a couple of days to figure out what's going on with your environment. So let's be efficient with that. Number two, do a vulnerability scan before you do a pen test. right? That the intention of a penetration test, and I know I've said this 1,000 times, I'm going to say it again, is to validate your controls. Part of your controls are scanning your IT infrastructure for vulnerabilities and patching them. That is a control. If you're not doing that, then you're going to have a 72-page penetration test report. And 80% of that is stuff you could have found and patched before we ever showed up. And so it is yet again, an inefficiency in the process. I would rather spend my time doing human exploitable things against your external footprint. Things like password spraying your M365 environment, right? Things like looking at the hygiene of your public facing web apps. Those are the things that I want to spend my time on, not sorting through, 27 hosts with outdated Apache. So yeah, we're going to find that stuff. Yeah, we're going to put it in your report. But we really want to focus on things that a real, hacker is going to do, a real APT is going to do. So yeah, that's my 2, right? It's really short and easy. Know what you have and spend a little bit of time doing some vulnerability scans on it and patching it up, before we get in there. So
what would you say, just because we're talking about externals, right? About social engineering.
Oh man, you're not doing that to me, are you? Okay.
In regards to prepping, I'm just thinking of external pen tests.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a good debate, right? And we've got a couple minutes to talk about it, so we might as well. We used to, some years ago, we always did social engineering as part of an external pen test. It was like assumed, right? Like you didn't even talk about it. It was like, yeah, we're going to phish you. In the last 5 to 10 years, you have things like KnowBe4 that have come out, and you whitelist them in your environment and you set them up so that you can create effective phish. And so, in addition to that, short-term spin up for phishing infrastructure has gotten harder. Now, I'm just talking about email right now. We'll talk about other stuff too, but yeah. So the email phishing stuff is a little bit harder these days, and I say that because, again, limited time engagement, right? We got 3 or 4 or 5 days, whatever, to attack your environment. The controls around phishing have become so good that I no longer can just go out and buy a domain and set everything up within 24, 48 hours, right? Because that domain instantly is flagged by most phishing infrastructure. So, and it helps too that everybody's going to cloud email. You have all those protections built in. And so now there are other kinds of social engineering, which I think I know some of the engagements you're talking about, that are in play, right? Perfect example. We were doing, I want to say it was an insurance company last year, and we couldn't figure out what the ID pattern was, right? So like when you have an insurance policy, it's like INS 00001A or some, random string. It's not random, but like it's a prescriptive string of numbers with patterns. And so we just called customer service and we're just like, hey, what is the format for your numbers? And they gave it to us. So things like that, I think, are in play. Things that are, I would say, will not cause harm, and things that are, in any other context would be would be negligible, if that makes sense. Right.
So if I'm a client and preparing for an external pen test, and I know social engineering is going to be a part of that engagement, I guess, like, what prep work, or is there any prep work? Because I imagine on the one hand, you don't want to just tell everybody, right? So
yeah. That's a good question, right? So my advice on that would be to review your processes and procedures internally. Right. So on another engagement where they specifically asked for social engineering, we were trying to gain access to an ISP or MSSP or whatever it is. And so we were calling and pretending to be a client so that we could potentially take over their client's account. And so we actually went over their processes and procedures during the kickoff. And they were like, here's where we think we're weak. Can you find a way to leverage this and show us that this creates weakness? And if you can, we'll fix it. And we did, right? We were successful on all of our phishing attempts, or not phishing, all of our social engineering attempts. And so therefore, I would like to assume that their processes were changed. So there is something you can do, and that is whatever is in scope, especially if you're asking for specific social engineering, is review those processes and procedures to make sure that there's not something you can already improve there. Right. Get those things as good as you can be, and then let us put our brain to work to try to figure out how to get around those.
That makes sense. And then I guess also, I imagine there are a lot of places where even if you have a procedure and a policy in place, how often are they actually being followed?
Are they following it? Yeah. And that's, it goes back to what we said earlier, right? We're talking about testing controls. And that's what a social engineering engagement is, even if your controls are perfect, are your people following them? So, and what is the impact if they don't? So cool. All right, gentlemen, that was fun. I like that a lot. Anything else to add before we go?
No, I'll just say, if you want to make your internal shorter, just give me domain admin credentials at the start of the test. And
there we go.
Yeah,
I knew it.
Funny story. I'm setting up a client. We're getting ready. We're getting prepped. And they're like, hey, do you want domain admin creds too, or just access to the environment? I mean, sure.
That was easy. Engagement over.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Kind of funny, but
nice. Yeah. Same for the external, right? If you want to just set me up on a VPN, you can do that. It'll make things a lot easier. So, listen, folks, that's all we have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it. That's the best way you can help us out and spread the word. Otherwise, we will see you next week.